So what is his plan? He is plowing ahead regardless, it seems.
Well, I think the key here, Anna, is that Vladimir Putin is plowing ahead from a position of weakness. The background to why Putin decides to fairly suddenly move ahead with the annexation of these occupied areas in eastern and southern Ukraine is Ukraine's counteroffensive that started at the end of August. You know, that counteroffensive quickly took more than 8,000 square kilometers, more than 3,000 square miles of territory, especially up in the northeast. It's now not only rolling back the Russian gains, it's actually threatening territory that Russia's held since 2014, areas where these referenda were held. For example, the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. But secondly, and this is where I think Putin's really weak and will continue to be weak, is that the annexation is linked to another step that he announced last Tuesday, which was, it's that this step is linked to another one that he announced almost 10 days ago. And that was the partial mobilization, he called it, of reservists within Russia. Now that has turned out to be an absolute chaotic shambles where Russian authorities are just sweeping up men, not just reservists, not men with military experience, but anyone they can lay hands on. And so that has actually fueled discontent within the country, which is, okay, you're sweeping up hundreds of thousands of men to put them on the front line and possibly make them cannon fodder in Ukraine with no regard to their status, with no regard to their health, sometimes with no regard to their age. So what does Putin do? Does he put his hands up and say, you know, gosh, in the face of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, I've really messed this up. You know, my people, the people I rely upon to keep this going, they're upset with me. Or does he double down? And the answer is he doubles down. So what we have seen in Moscow is we're going to have this big ceremony tomorrow. There are going to be two sides of it. One is that in the Kremlin itself, Putin will sign the decree that they've annexed the two regions in the east, the two in the south. Then Red Square is already being put up. You know, there's video monitors, there's billboards, you know, there'll be military on display. And his hope is, look, he's going to rally patriotic Russians to make occupied Ukraine part of their country. Problem here is battlefield is the reality in the end. And if he cannot produce at least a resistance to the Ukrainian counteroffensive, you can shout annex at the top of your lungs. But at the end of the day, you're going to wind up losing nevertheless.
So presumably, in annexing these areas of Ukraine and recognizing them as part of Russia, and he would then be able to try to gather more forces from within those areas and mobilize them. Is that right?
Well, that's what Ukrainian authorities are saying. And we've got some evidence that, yeah, you will conscript Ukrainian men in these areas to be part of the Donetsk People's Republic Army or the Luhansk People's Republic Army. The problem here is they've already got about as many men as they can get from these areas in terms of the men who actually do side with the Russian proxies, who actually do think maybe Ukraine should be part of Russia. How many Ukrainian men who are still left, who haven't left the area, are going to willingly go to the battlefield? And even if you could put them on the battlefield, how many of them are really going to fight for you? You know, you cannot fight a war through coercion of the local population. You just can't do it. So no, I don't think this step actually changes the military balance.
It's still really difficult to get any independent reporting out of Russia. And to find out what anything but the state media would tell you. I've been quite surprised recently. I did see some video footage of the conscription and people being signed up. And as you said, there appeared to be some people who were elderly and unfit and not the type of people you would expect to be sending to the front line. But I was also interested to hear there was one report which featured a man who said, well, look, we made a promise to defend our motherland. And it would seem that there is still that very strong belief in certain quarters that what Putin is doing is right for Russia. But do you think that's fading?
Well, we have to remember that it's never an all or nothing situation with a population in times of war. We think, all right, there's Russians who are protesting against this. Maybe there's an anti-war movement. Indeed, there is. But on the other hand, you've got to recognize that there are people who support Putin, have done so for a long time, and that their support for Putin, they just get more and more entrenched the more difficult it becomes, because you don't want to lose. If you lose, you've lost everything that you've invested in this man and in Mother Russia. That said, I think here's where I start as an analyst. If this mobilization had been carried out very effectively, if it had been thought through, if it had called up reservists who were of military age, who had military experience, then okay, you still continue to have a well of support. But when you have this chaotic process where anyone is vulnerable to just being snatched by the Russian authorities, and there are men in their 60s who have been snatched by these people to go and fight in Ukraine, it does two things. One is it upsets people because you don't know what the rules are. You don't know what the system is doing. And secondly, it doesn't show you doing well. It shows you in a position where you are weak and you're getting weaker and almost desperate. And so, yeah, I think the longer this mobilization goes on, unless the Russians could cure their problems with supply, logistics, and morale, the worse it becomes for Vlad. But over a timeline isn't days or weeks, but probably months.
Just briefly, Scott, as with Crimea, when Russia annexed Crimea, that was not recognized by certain countries around the world. Do you think there will be any support from any countries to recognize these 4 areas once Russia has annexed them?
Well, here's your starting point, Anna. There were 3 countries that recognized the so-called independent Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, 2 of the 4 territories being annexed. Those 3 countries were Syria, North Korea, and Belarus. Not exactly what you would call the heavyweights of the international community, and all 3 of them very much linked to Russia for quite some time, and in the case of Syria and Belarus, dependent on them. Yeah. So far, what is significant is that after Putin announced the intention on September 20th that he was going to annex these territories, China, not a word. India, not a word. The African nations, not a word. Latin America, not a word. So even if these countries are staying very much on the fence regarding the conflict, for reasons we can go into, they're not going to invest their political capital in saying, hurrah, isn't this a great move that occupied Ukraine is now part of Russia?